All right, guys, the second battle we're going to talk about today is Gettysburg. What happened in Gettysburg? Okay, the battle. Several battles and skirmishes occurred in the months after Antietam. Confederate General Stonewall Jackson was wounded at the Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia in May 1863. Confederate General Lee said, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right arm." Jackson died a few days later of pneumonia. Lee wrote, "It is a terrible loss. I do not know how to replace him." But a Confederate victory at Chancellorsville convinced Lee to attempt a second invasion of Union territory. Okay, so after Antietam, which we just learned about, there were a couple battles and some fighting going on. And in Chancellorsville, which is Virginia, in May of 1863, General Stonewall Jackson, he was wounded. So he lost his left arm, but General Lee said, "I've lost my right arm." And by that, he's meaning, like his buddy, his right-hand man, the guy who's like by his side helping him the most. Okay. So Jackson ended up dying. General Lee was super sad. But the Confederates got a victory in Chancellorsville. So Lee said, "All right, I'm catching momentum. We're going to invade Union territory again." In June, Confederate General Lee led his army of almost 72,000 men into Pennsylvania. Lee invaded the North to gather supplies for his army, and because he hoped a major victory in Union territory would make the Union lose the will to fight. This invasion led to the Battle of Gettysburg, a three-day battle from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg was critical because it would determine whether Lee's invasion of the North would be successful. All right, so in June, Confederate General Lee, he took 72,000 men. He went and invaded the north side in Pennsylvania, Gettysburg. So he was hoping that if the Confederate or the South won a battle in the Union territory, the Union would be like, "That's it. We've lost on our own land. This is over." Okay, let's see what happened. Union forces, led by General George Meade, occupied Cemetery Ridge, the high ground. On the first day of the battle, Colonel Joshua Chamberlain successfully led a charge down Little Round Top, a nearby hill, to capture nearly 100 Confederate soldiers and prevent their advances on the left flank or side. On the third day, Confederate General Lee ordered Officer George Edward Pickett and two other generals to lead their divisions up the hill directly into enemy fire. Pickett's charge was a disaster for the Confederates. In the end, the three-day Battle of Gettysburg caused more than 51,000 casualties, including close to 8,000 killed. Confederate General Lee's army was seriously weakened, and his second and final attempt to invade the North was a failure. The Union had a clear victory. The tide of the war would continue to flow in the Union's favor. Okay, so General Lee thought, "I'm going to invade in Gettysburg. That's the Northland. If we can win here, then we're going to really weaken up the Union." Well, that didn't happen. The Confederate lost the battle. The Union won at Gettysburg, and the Union was just gaining more and more momentum. The memorial. Several months later, on November 19, 1863, a cemetery was dedicated at the site of the Battle of Gettysburg. President Lincoln was the second speaker that day, following a 2-hour speech. His simple address lasted only 2 minutes. He spoke with a serious and solemn tone about the soldiers who had fallen. He invoked the Declaration of Independence and its principles of liberty and equality and the proposition that all men are created equal. He linked the Civil War to the American Revolution, reinforcing the purpose of the Civil War as a new birth of freedom and equality for the nation. Instead of just focusing on preserving the union of government, Lincoln suggested that the real goals of the war were the preservation of both unity and freedom. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address has often been described as one of the most eloquent speeches in history. All right, so in November 19th, 1863, there was a cemetery that was dedicated at the site of Gettysburg because 51,000 people died. It was bad. Okay, there were a lot of people injured there. Did they die or were they injured? Let me look real quick. 8,000 killed, 51,000 casualties, including to 8,000 killed. A lot of people were injured. Okay, so Lincoln spoke here. He spoke for 2 minutes. He talked about the Declaration of Independence and liberty and equality and that all men are created equal. He basically said the Civil War was linked to the American Revolution because the American Revolution was a fight for the freedom of the United States, to form the United States. So the Civil War was just new birth of that freedom and equality for the entire nation. So this Gettysburg Address, it's famous speech, and it was very eloquent or spoken very well. If you click here, you can see the whole Gettysburg Address. Thanks, guys.